Today we're going to be talking about blood and the components of blood and arteries. So title for today can be blood. Easy as that. Today we're going to be talking about the function and characteristics of each part of the blood. We are going to also be talking about arteries, veins, and capillaries as well, and talking about ratios. So the first thing I want to go over is blood vessels and blood. Your blood vessels are like highways that go throughout your body. Before we talk about what blood vessels actually do and what blood does, I would like you to think, what might need to be transported in your body? Lots of things need to be transported. I'm sure that whatever answer you wrote is probably correct. So we're going to talk about the different things that blood helps do and helps transport. So go ahead and write down, what does blood do? It does a lot of different things. You may have said carries oxygen. That's one of the most common things that we talk about. It transports oxygen and food or nutrients to cells. We're going to talk a little bit later on why oxygen is so important. But basically, oxygen helps our cells make energy. Without energy, they can't do anything that they need to do, and they end up dying. They also need nutrients. Nutrients to be able to build molecules, to generate energy. So blood, first and foremost, transports oxygen. And it not only transports oxygen to our cells, but it takes away the waste as well. And so the waste is going to be CO2. So what you're seeing here is actually a picture of part of the lungs, the air sacs in the lungs. And so the air sacs in the lungs, that's where we're breathing in the oxygen, and that's where the oxygen is going to go into the blood. Eventually, our cells have to get rid of the CO2, and the blood brings the CO2 back to the lungs, and then we breathe it out. So oxygen, CO2. It also transports hormones. You probably know about hormones like estrogen and testosterone. There's lots of other hormones as well. Cortisol is a hormone that's released when you're stressed. So there are many different types of hormones that are secreted throughout the day. Hormones are like messenger molecules. They send a message from one cell to another. So we make the hormones at one spot, but then they have to get to cells somewhere else. And so they get to those cells or travel around the body using the blood vessels. Also helps with water balance. If you get really dehydrated, what happens is there's actually less water in your blood. It takes some of the water out of your bloodstream and uses it for your cells so that your cells don't suffer. If you drink lots and lots of water, then you're going to have a higher water content in your blood. So it helps maintain your water balance throughout your body. It also maintains the pH. pH is a scale that tells us how acidic or basic something is. And this is really important for our blood. We're actually going to learn that the more CO2 in our blood, the more acidic it is. And that actually tells our brain has, there are signals that tell our brain, oh, our blood is too acidic, we need to breathe more and get more oxygen and less CO2. So it helps maintain the acidity or basicity of our blood. So if you don't know the word pH balance and you would like to write acid and base next to it, that might be a good thing to write. And then it's also part of our immune system. You've probably heard of like white blood cells, antibodies, and a lot of parts of our immune system are found in our blood. So it helps fight off foreign invaders. So our blood does lots of different things. The last thing it does is it helps with blood clotting. You might think of a blood clot as a bad thing. Like, oh, people die from blood clots. But blood clotting is actually a good thing because without blood clotting, we wouldn't form scabs and we would keep bleeding forever and ever. So these are the things that blood does, lots of different things, okay? And you need to be able to pick out several of these things if we ask you about it on a test. So now we're going to talk about what blood is made out of. I want to show you a picture of a tube of blood. You're like, well, this doesn't look like blood, it's yellow. Well, we're going to talk about why it looks the way it does. If I put some dirt in a jar and I shake it up, it gets all muddy, right? And if I let it sit over time, the dirt is heavy and it ends up settling to the bottom. The water is lighter and it's going to be on the top. The same thing happens with blood. And a lot of times we speed this process up by using this fancy machine called a centrifuge. This centrifuge spins the blood around and causes it to settle faster. So instead of like waiting hours and hours for the dirt to settle out, it would cause all the dirt to go to the bottom right away. So heavy stuff goes to the bottom, light stuff goes to the top. And this was how they kind of figured out that there are different parts of blood. They also looked under the microscope and saw there were different types of cells. So when we spin this blood around in a centrifuge, it goes from all red to separating out the parts. And we're going to talk about each one of these parts. At the top is the lightest part. This is the liquid part. And at the bottom is the heaviest stuff, the red blood cells. So if you have a chart in your notebook that I gave to you, you can use that. Otherwise, if you don't have a printed chart, just make a chart that looks like this in your notebook. We will have quite a few bullet points in here, so don't make them super skinny. You probably want maybe three notebook lines in between for our boxes here. Go ahead and pause the video if you need more time to write. We're going to go through the different parts of the blood that we saw here in our centrifuged tube of blood in the chart. So the first thing is the plasma, and the plasma is what was at the top. So I'm going to flip back really quick. Okay, plasma is up here. That's the liquidy yellow stuff. All right, so plasma, what does it do? It transports stuff. If we didn't have plasma, our blood would not be a liquid. The reason our blood's a liquid because it has these blood cells and they float in this liquid. I know it all looks red. That's because there's so many red blood cells. So it's liquid, it's mostly water, it's yellowish. You can donate plasma. You may have heard of that. Instead of donating blood, you can donate plasma. And they use it for a variety of different medical applications. But this is really going to transport things. It's going to be a lot easier for things to move through our bloodstream if they're in a liquid. And that's what plasma does. Next, we have the red blood cells. I'm going to flip back to that picture really quickly. Right? Red blood cells, they're on the bottom. There's a lot of red blood cells, and that's why our blood looks red, is because there's so many red blood cells. So red blood cells, what do? They're in charge of transporting oxygen. They have something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's a molecule. It's made of iron, and it helps them transport oxygen to our cells. We're going to learn about diseases when you don't have enough iron. You're considered anemic, and you get tired really easily because you can't transport as much oxygen as normal. This is a picture of our blood cells, our red blood cells. There's not a nucleus. They are one of the the few cells in our body that don't have nucleuses. So there's no nucleus there, and they have a lot of space to hold a lot of oxygen. They live about 3 to 4 months, so pretty long time. That's why sometimes it can take a while for anemia to resolve itself, because if you're trying to create new red blood cells, it takes a while for you to create new ones, for the old ones to die. And then the old cells are removed by your liver and your spleen. So when they die, they're removed. Fun fact, your poop is actually brown because the red blood cells that die and get cleaned out by your liver and your spleen actually color it that brownish color. So it's actually from the old red blood cells. So if we take a look at this picture here, I know it says circle a red blood cell, but we're just going to take a look. The red blood cells here are the pinkish circles. You see how there's so many of them everywhere? They're like the most common blood cell type in your blood. We'll talk about what these other guys are in a minute. So we so far have plasma, we have red blood cells. Next up, we've got white blood cells. I'm going to flip back to our little centrifuge image. So white blood cells and platelets are what we're going to talk about next, and they're in this middle layer. There's not a ton of them. Platelets are really small. They're kind of in between. Red blood cells are heavy, plasma is really light, and then the white blood cells and platelets are in between. So our white blood cells fight off infections. There are actually many different types of white blood cells. They're not all the same, and we'll talk about that in a second. They have a really big nucleus, and they live a pretty short lifespan. Sometimes if you go to the doctor, they might order a blood test to count how many red blood cells, white blood cells you have. And if your white blood cells are high, probably means you're fighting off an infection at that time. So if we take a look at what white blood cells look like, they're these big ones. So white blood cells are a lot bigger. The nucleus generally is this purple part inside. And some of them have kind of funny shaped nuclei. Sometimes they have more than one nucleus. They're really interesting. But the really big guys, these are white blood cells that fight off invaders. And if you're fighting off an infection, you're going to have more of them. And then, last but not least, we have platelets. And platelets are these, sometimes we draw them as little spiky guys. They're actually not whole cells. They're just pieces of cells, fragments, so parts of cells. And they help form blood clots, which again, we said are not necessarily bad because they help us stop the bleeding when we get a cut. Because they're just a part of a cell, they don't actually have a nucleus. They live kind of in between range, 7 to 10 days. So those are our 4 parts of blood. If we take a look at which ones are the most common, let's take a look at this picture. So red blood cells, they're going to be the most common. Platelets are the little tiny specks we see in here. And then we have white blood cells. So the ratio we're going to use when we're calculating the amount of red blood cells, the amount of white blood cells, the amount of platelets, we're going to use a ratio to help us calculate this. So I want you to write this ratio down. We have, for every 1 white blood cell, they're the least common, we have about 30 platelets, they're middle of the road common, and 600 red blood cells. So let's do a practice problem here. I have 20 white blood cells. How many platelets do I have? Let's talk about how we set this up. What we can do is we can make a ratio here. We know that there is 1 white blood cell for 30 platelets. So I'm going to put that into a fraction here. 1 white blood cell for every 30 platelets. That comes from our ratio. And I'm going to set it equal to what I know. I know I have 20 white blood cells, and I'm trying to figure out how many platelets there are. So I have a question mark here. You can put an X. Then what we're going to do is we are going to cross multiply. So when we cross multiply here, I'm going to get 20 times 30 on one side and X on the other side. So 20 times 30 is 600. So that's going to be my answer for platelets. If we do another practice problem, okay, here's another one. If I have 900 platelets, how many red blood cells do I have? Okay, so again, we're going to use my ratio, right? 30 platelets. I know that from my ratio up here. 30 platelets to 600 red blood cells. So I'm going to put that as a fraction. And then I'm going to set it equal to what I know. I know I have 900 platelets, but I don't know how many red blood cells I have. Again, when you set this up, you want to make sure platelets are across from platelets and red blood cells are across from red blood cells. So I can cross multiply here. When I cross multiply, I get 600 times 900. So that's what I wrote on one side. On the other side, I have 30 and then question mark, which 30 we'll use x for the question mark, so 30x. Then I'm just going to solve for x. 540,000 equals 30x. So to get x on its own, I can divide each side by 30. So 18,000 red blood cells is our answer. So that's how that ratio works. You might be wondering, where are new blood cells made? Well, new blood cells are made in the bone marrow. Bone marrow is the inside of your bones, and there are actually stem cells inside of your bone marrow, and they create the new blood cells. And then when the blood cells go through their lifespan, they end up dying, they get cleaned out by the liver and the spleen, and the process starts all over again.